This podcast is solely for educational purposes and isn't intended as a substitute for the advice of a qualified professional. Hi, and welcome to the NPDCAST, where I, a narcissist, talk about the ins and outs of NPD, also known as narcissistic personality disorder. Throughout this series, I will discuss the reality of NPD as well as the recovery process, the ups and downs, and the complexities. You can call me Nin. I highly suggest you check out my first episode, or at least the very beginning, to hear my disclaimers. I'm not here to tell you what to think or believe, only to keep an open mind and heart as I discuss my experience and what's worked for me. Today's topic is defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are tricky, and there's lots of negativity that surrounds them. That's because they're exactly how they sound: defensive. They're an automatic reaction to keep us from conflict or danger. The trouble with defense mechanisms is that they can also be inappropriately timed, meaning we can be inclined to react to a situation defensively when the situation doesn't call for it. This can be exacerbated by trauma disorders, typically relating to the hyperarousal and awareness that comes with them. The more alert we are to the danger, the more we're inclined to react inappropriately when it's unnecessary. This can interconnect with post-traumatic stress disorder quite significantly, and examples of this connection can be being easily frightened by raised voices due to trauma, and thus when you hear raised voices you might react defensively in order to protect yourself, even when raised voices have nothing to do with you or are raised playfully or because the environment is loud. When it comes to NPD, defense mechanisms are complex. We're not just talking about being easily startled or defending ourselves against violence. It's a psychological battlefield, a constant internal fight we have to navigate to avoid outbursts and embarrassing ourselves. It's difficult, to say the least. Defensiveness when it comes to insecurity comes in all shapes and sizes. We might be inclined to be defensive about our appearance, diet, lifestyle, money, family, or skill set. We might become defensive when we feel challenged or intimidated. I've spoken before about how it's not uncommon for people with NPD to experience false beliefs, also known as delusions, wherein a false reality can become very much real to us in order to protect us from the true reality that is causing us harm. When that reality is threatened, we might turn to defense mechanisms to protect ourselves, to keep that false reality from shattering. So what are these defense mechanisms I'm talking about? How do they present themselves in our behaviour? A lot of these defense mechanisms in today's society are referred to incorrectly as red flags. Manipulation is an obvious one. On the surface, it can appear as cruel and insidious, and indeed there are people who actively use manipulation to benefit from others. But I'm referring to manipulation when it's used as a protective measure. We might manipulate another in order to feel back in control of our fragile false reality. It helps us feel powerful and as though we are back in the driver's seat. Exploiting and taking advantage of others can be a distraction from the distressing feelings we're experiencing. Another mechanism is aggression. Outbursts, overreactivity, verbal or physical aggression. It also allows us to regain control over a situation. When we feel helpless, intimidated, challenged, or vulnerable, what better way to go and get our attacker to back down than to raise the hackles, our voices, and turn up the aggression? We might use projection, blaming others instead of accepting responsibility or acknowledging our own flaws. We might even rationalize our incorrect or unhealthy behavior in order to feel better about our mistakes or overreactivity, because a significant part of NPD is that many experiencing it also struggle immensely with shame. Behaving negatively, wherein we hurt our partners, family, or friends, can make us feel ashamed, or if we feel judged, we might also feel shame, which can trigger those defense mechanisms. And so it becomes a highly toxic cycle where we feel threatened, we react, we feel ashamed, and then we feel threatened again. How does one fix this? Well, it's no secret that society needs to do better in not confusing defense mechanisms with malicious intent. Because these mechanisms are villainized, people feel too ashamed to seek help for them. On top of this, we become caught up in the shame of it and don't seek help or ignore the warning signs and ignore how they're hurting us and those around us. It's easier to pretend nothing is wrong and that everyone else is the problem than it is to tackle trauma and face inner conflict. It's important, if you experience defense mechanisms when faced with either significant conflict or minor conflict, that you seek help. It's possible you experience trauma that led to these mechanisms, and that by better breaking down and understanding the trauma, you might just be able to implement coping mechanisms that keep you from those automatic reactions. It's possible to recognize them and prevent them, but it takes a lot of work. If you have someone in your life, you could go over your concerns with them and ask that they respectfully help you discover these warning signs. In therapy, I learned to imagine my conflicts like a roller coaster. I needed to look ahead and spot the very top so I could prepare for the drop. I knew it was coming, and I knew when, and although I couldn't stop the drop altogether, I could be completely ready for it and totally in control the whole way down. That really helped me in future circumstances where I felt threatened, where I felt challenged. Instead of suddenly finding myself plummeting, having gotten distracted from finding the top, I knew the drop was coming and I was ready. As mentioned in the last podcast, the best tool in your toolbox is yourself. You are and can be in control of everything if you don't let your mental health control you. Before we end, I'll be going over a couple of questions. The first is, are there defense mechanisms that a person with NPD might use that some may misunderstand as a power tactic, like manipulation, resisting making concessions to societal demands, etc.? I think the majority of any defense mechanisms can be misinterpreted. They get confused with exploitative methods where people are seeking to benefit from others and gain advantage over them. That's never the case with NPD. It's always about finding higher ground solely because it's safer to be above than it is to be below, and being below is what we fear most. A lot of the time we hear society refer to defense mechanisms as red flags, dislikable or off-putting behaviours others exhibit, which is unfortunate because typically these behaviours are a result of trauma and need addressing. Too often does society shame them, turning them into toxic, monstrous traits, villainizing them. It makes it much more difficult for us to find help and seek out resources for these behaviours because of this. The second is, are there any defense mechanisms a person with NPD might use that actually are means of calculated behaviours? I don't think any defense mechanisms are calculated even when NPD is involved. That's because they're automatic. Do I think people with NPD are capable of being calculated individuals? Absolutely, the same as anyone else is. But that's a matter of emotional intelligence rather than because of defense mechanisms. Those are automatic reactions, sometimes ones we're completely unaware of having, carried out in order for the brain and body to protect us. I think people put too much weight on defense mechanisms and often confuse them with selfish motive. There's nothing selfish about defense mechanisms, and experiencing them doesn't make you selfish or wrong. What matters is what you do about them, and whether you care if you're hurting those around you or not. As usual, if you have any questions you'd like to be answered during the next or most relevant episode, feel free to leave them in the comments. Next time I will be diving into the topic of splitting. Thanks so much for tuning in to the NPD cast today, and hopefully you learned something valuable about yourself or someone in your life through listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a comment or a star. It really helps me see what direction I'm heading in. Until next time, I've been Nin. Bye!